Thank you, Greg, for your introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the second day of the LNG and BC conference. It's a pleasure to be part of a forum that brings together industry leaders who will invest and develop British Columbia's LNG export opportunities. Asia's desire for energy security is driving this conversation we are having here today. The numbers, of course, are staggering. Asia's middle class will grow from 500 million people to 1.75 billion by 2020. The hopes, dreams, and most importantly, consumption patterns of those nearly 2 billion people remains one of the most important stories of the next half-century. To fuel those aspirations will require energy. Liquefied natural gas will play an integral role in a rising Asia. To help build BC's LNG industry will require the cooperation of government, LNG exporters, investors, financial institutions, and Asian buyers. And our next two guests will play an integral role in that conversation, and it's my pleasure to moderate today's discussion. I ask that you hold your applause after I introduce both of our speakers. Mr. Marvin Odum is president of Shell Oil Company and upstream director of Royal Dutch Shell's subsidiary companies in the Americas. With Shell since 1982, he directs a broad portfolio from traditional oil and gas development to emerging technologies. Mr. Odum is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, serves on the boards of the Business Roundtable and American Petroleum Institute, and is an executive committee member of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. He also serves on the Harvard Kennedy School's Dean's Council and the advisory board of the University of Texas Cockrell School of Engineering. The Honourable Christy Clark was sworn in for her second term as British Columbia's 35th Premier in June of 2013. In her new mandate, Premier Clark continues her relentless focus on strengthening the economy and to ensure the province seizes the natural gas opportunity. Ms. Clark previously served as Deputy Premier, Minister of Education, Minister of Children and Family Development, and Vice Chair of the Treasury Board. She has received several awards, including the IWCA Woman of Distinction Award and the 2009 Woman of the Year in BC by the Consumer Choice Awards. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honourable Christy Clark and Mr. Marvin Odum. Thank you very much for this, folks. It's a wonderful opportunity to talk to somebody from Shell who plays such an integral role in the energy game, and Premier Clark, as I said, your relentless energy in regards to promoting LNG. You know, I was thinking yesterday, how do I start this conversation? Because the math when it comes to energy used to be so simple. OPEC nations created or produced the energy, and OECD nations consumed it. And then the shale gas revolution occurred, and the math has been turned upside down in many cases. Mr. Odum, let me start with you first of all. Give me a sense of what the trends and development of global energy consumption are, number one, and where does LNG fit within that?
Well, it always comes back to me grounding yourself in population. So, it's not a new story, but the idea that the world is moving from 7 billion people today to 9 billion people by the middle of the century, that represents a tremendous amount of energy consumption. And there are a lot of different estimates, and you can look at various energy mixes and efficiencies and so forth, but in most cases, that means a doubling of energy consumption from the beginning of this century to the middle of this century. So that's the backdrop for energy, is the incredible demand that's going to be there. And now that's going to require all energies to fill that space. But I think the particular place for natural gas and for LNG as a part of that natural gas formula is that fossil fuels are going to continue to be a big part of the picture. Natural gas will be the preferred fuel because it's cleaner in virtually every respect. And I think for that reason, you'll continue to see a very significant growth in natural gas consumption.
There's been a tremendous amount of interest in getting into the LNG space here in Canada, United States, and many other parts of the world. Give me a sense of where the United States, particularly the west coast of the United States, is in regards to getting involved in the LNG game, number one, and what are you looking for in a final investment decision? Because they're ultimately going to be our competitors as well. Where are we in regards to the LNG issue in the US, and ultimately, how and when do you come to a final investment decision? Because that's a very big decision ultimately.
Yeah, these are, I think that's the kind of the understatement of the day. These are huge decisions, tens of billions of dollars associated with each one of these projects, each one of these major decisions. I don't think the things we're looking for will probably surprise anybody in the audience too much. I mean, it starts with the resource. You need a vast quality resource to draw from, in this case, natural gas. In this case, Western Canada is blessed with that type of resource. I think the other things that obviously it will require is you need a competitive project. So as a company that's in business, that's looking at the LNG business around the world, there's a lot of competition between these projects, and that comes down to fiscal and regulatory stability, knowing what to expect and knowing that you can trust that being in place for a long period of time. And it requires the kind of collaboration and work with local communities and others where you can see this being a partnership that could last for decades looking forward. So that's getting that competitiveness, getting that predictability, having an environment where you can do business for decades to come. Those are the primary things we look for.
And in regards to the U.S., though, whereabouts are we in that conversation in regards to LNG? And can we expect to see an LNG facility on the coast of the United States, or 2 or 3 of them?
Well, I think on the West Coast, it's a bigger question. So I think, coming out of the Gulf Coast of the U.S., undoubtedly you'll start to see LNG working there. And, we're working projects, a lot of the companies that we work with are working projects down there, and some of those will happen. And that'll be part of the bigger equation for LNG around the world. I think the big question for me right now really is more around how many projects will there be in Western Canada? How many projects will there be in British Columbia? And I think that's a story yet to be written, and we can talk about some of the aspects that will drive that one way or the other, but that's the really, I think, most interesting part of this story.
Well, that's a perfect segue to talk to our Premier. Premier, you have been the #1 champion for LNG in this province. Prior to the election, during the election, and especially including after the election, and you've, I think, have been on, 5 trade missions now to Asia, and as I was saying in the back room, by the time you get over jet lag, I'm sure your staff will have organized a 6th one. Give me a sense of where we are here in British Columbia in regards to our LNG aspirations. Do we need to move faster? Where are we right now in your mind?
I think in terms of the timing, we're on track. In terms of our aspirations, though, here's how I think of it. We have the opportunity to create 100,000 new jobs in British Columbia. We want to make sure that British Columbians are first in line for those jobs. We have the opportunity, the biggest opportunity we've ever had as a province, to contribute to reducing climate change by exporting this clean fossil fuel to Asia, reducing their reliance on things like coal. We have the opportunity to work with First Nations leaders to lift whole communities up. And when I meet with First Nations leaders, and I know there are many, many First Nations citizens who are participating in this conference, I think to myself, First Nations leaders want exactly the same thing for their communities that we all want. Healthy, thriving communities where every young person has a great shot at a job, where every young person has a shot at a great education. And natural gas is part of the way that we get there. So we have a generational opportunity for our whole province, for all of our kids, and more specifically, we have an opportunity to lift up a generation of people who have, frankly, been left out of the economic mainstream for way, way too long. Add to that the environmental benefits of this. This is why we hold these aspirations, because we think that we can do good for ourselves and do good for the world.
How close are we to a final investment decision from perhaps one of the proponents? Can we expect one this year?
Well, I don't know, Marvin could surprise us today.
Yeah.
I think...
Probably not today.
We did, when I was in Malaysia and Singapore, sign 2 letters of intent to start our project development agreements. We want to have that with Woodfibre and with Petronas, respectively. Our deadline for that is November 30th. That's the process that is the final milestone in getting to final investment decision for those companies. And that means we're going to tie up all the tax certainty, the regulatory burden, and fix it so that they, as Marvin said, certainty is a really important part of final investment decision. Every company moves at their own speed, but I think we may see 1 or perhaps 2 final investment decisions this year.
This year?
That's what I hope.
Wow, wow. I was at a conference in Seattle a few weeks ago, an energy conference predominantly focusing on the U.S. export market. But one of the analysts there was providing some statistics, and one of them just stood out to me, and I want to share that with you in regards to global energy demand. He said that if you triple natural gas use, quadruple the use of renewables, quintuple the use of nuclear energy, you would still need to double coal consumption in the world to deal with the demand, though the bulk of it driven by Asia. So you talk about the need for energy, and you look at statistics like this, and it's quite mind-boggling. But at that conference, one of the core issues that I took from it was that natural gas plays an important role in all of this. It's a transitional fuel source. And I think Shell has made a concentrated effort to move further into the natural gas space. Correct me if I'm wrong here. Has that sort of been the discussion and conversation at Shell in the last decade or so?
No, it has very much been. You know, I think if you know anything about Shell, you know we do a lot of work in what we call the scenario space. So just thinking about where the world is headed over the next 50 to 100 years. And what that's told us is with the kind of energy demand growth that we talked about, and that sort of population growth, you basically see these stresses really emerging. The stresses around food, stresses around water, and stresses around energy supply. And so solving those stresses, which are very much interrelated, drives you to certain energy types. And it really, natural gas really starts to emerge as a preferred fuel in that sort of equation. So a number of years ago, I mean, you could even take it back maybe 10 years, we started shifting this profile to increase the amount of natural gas in our own production and our own investments. And actually in 2013 was the first year we actually produced more on an equivalent basis, more natural gas than we did oil.
Last year?
Last year.
Wow, wow. Premier, yesterday in the news, the big news story, of course, was the deal between Russia and China. I believe it was a $300 billion deal over spread over 30 years, and I think the New York Times was saying that that deal would represent about 10% of China's energy needs over the next 3 decades. More importantly, when you look at that issue, does this narrow the time that we have to get the LNG industry up and running in this province? Does this scare you?
I have been concerned about our speed on this from the very beginning. We started this about 2.5 years ago, talking to the people of the province about getting this done. And we are getting very close, we think, to final investment decisions. And you know, Shell is continuing to invest in the province. So I don't know that we could go any faster. We are doing everything that we can to get there. Competitive environment changes every day. So there's, you know, the developments in Russia and China. There are other developments in the market, the Gulf Coast, and all around the world all the time. So we're always watching that. Having said that, we're going as fast as we can. And I think a better person to answer that question is Marvin, because he's the guy, it's the private sector that decides whether or not they're going to make these investments based on what we see happening in the market.
Is it a game changer?
Well, I think you get, again, I'll go back to the resource. The resource is right in British Columbia, but what we can't forget is how competitive this business really is. So, you know, a $10 to $20 billion investment in an LNG facility, you're going to put that in what you think is the best, most stable, most competitive environment you can find around the world. And that is the opportunity for British Columbia. That's where the vision of the Premier really stands out and what she's trying to create here in the province. That's why we're working here. That's why we're putting a lot of time and effort and money into this project right now, is because we think it has the potential to compete. Yeah. Now that will actually reveal itself now over the next, you know, year to 2 years, and you know, as we nail down how we manage labor issues in the country. Because think about the number of potential projects in British Columbia. I know this has been a topic of conversation at the conference for sure. The amount of workforce it takes to make that happen. This is both an enormous opportunity, as you've already described it, but also a challenge for myself as someone looking to approve a project like this, is can we create an environment where we don't see hyperinflation and cost skyrocketing so that we can build a competitive project. So that'll be one of the primary things we keep a close eye on going forward.
Premier, when you brought in the regulatory regime for LNG, was there an assumption there would be a pipeline or two going into China anyway when you were getting to that point of introducing the tax legislation? Was there a discussion among the bureaucracy and the cabinet that, look, we got to assume there's going to be some natural gas flowing from Russia into China?
Well, I think our assumption was the market is going to continue to change every day. It's going to continue to be extremely competitive. And we've worked from that assumption from day one. We've also just gone as fast as we possibly can, seeking social license, making sure we're as competitive as we can, working as closely as we can with the companies. And I don't know that you can go any faster than as fast as we can. So my job, particularly since the election, has just been to go pedal to the metal, make this the central preoccupation of government, focus every minister and ministry across government on making a contribution to making this happen. And in that respect, Jazz, nothing has changed because we've always treated this as a very competitive market.
I think, if I could just add to that, I think that, as I look at the Russian-Chinese deal, I'd share that perspective, as it doesn't change the outlook here at all. And if you just take, isolate that for what it is, about 30 million tons per annum, to put it in LNG terms, of potential gas going from Russia into China, the big decision about how much LNG demand that will be there will be China deciding how much of its energy mix it wants natural gas to be. And that number could change dramatically and opens up plenty of space for projects like British Columbia.
Marvin, you raised the issue of labor market and skills training, and you're seeing some of those issues happen in Australia at the moment. I was looking at some numbers this morning. Hayes, which is a global oil and gas recruitment agency, in their 2013 survey found that average salary levels in the Australia oil and gas sector were the highest of the 53 countries that they had surveyed. So you're talking about labor and the fact that it can jeopardize projects just because of the costs. Is there anything Shell can do in regards to move projects along, or are you sort of at the mercy of the market at the end of the day when it comes to labor shortages? Yeah. That is an issue here in British Columbia.
It's a great question, though, because this is such a core issue for us that it's one of our primary issues when it comes to making the final investment decision. I want to clarify something on the jobs, though. So what I get concerned about is hyperinflation around these sort of jobs and some of the cost to build these projects. It doesn't take away from the fact that the jobs and the workforce that make up the entity that can make this happen are extremely well-paying jobs in a non-hyperinflationary kind of market. So I don't want to give the wrong impression there. First of all, these are very good, solid, very well-paying jobs. What we have to do as a company then is think about what's the timing of our decision, what's the methodology through which we contract our various suppliers to build these projects and so forth, and to do that in a way that alleviates or mitigates those potential problems as much as possible. But I will tell you, particularly in a place like British Columbia, what I look for is, like the vision of the Premier, is how do you build a workforce as much as possible from within Canada to make this happen? And recognizing that some of these projects and some of the peak construction periods are still a number of years away, how do you build up the workforce in that interim period so that you're ready for that activity? That is actually weighs very heavily on my decision.
Premier, jump in on this, because the conversation about skills training has been very important. There's some critics that say we need to put more money into it. You think we need to sort of recalibrate the education system a little bit, because there is savings there, but also in regards to getting people ready for those types of jobs. Touch on that a little bit.
You bet. We've been working the last year, and Shell deserves a great deal of credit for this, because it was 2 years ago that representatives of Shell said to us, look, skills training is going to be the biggest barrier to this investment happening. We've got to have a skilled workforce, and we can't experience the kind of wage inflation that people have seen in other jurisdictions. So we've spent a lot of time working through our skills training plan. And so that's meant making it data-driven, first of all, trying to understand what the market's going to need, figuring out what jobs are going to be out there based on our work with the private sector, and then re-engineering our post-secondary, our apprenticeship, and our secondary school system so that we can make sure that people have the training that they need to take advantage of those jobs, working with First Nations so that First Nations get the unique training that's required in remote communities in particular to take advantage of the employment opportunities, working with labor unions, and I see labor is represented here as well, to work, to ensure that their members and their strong experience in apprenticeship training is recognized and a part of this, working with the federal government, bringing all of our partners together. But we have to be able to supply that workforce. And I've always said British Columbians first. We want to make sure that BC workers are the priority in this. And our job as a government is to make sure that when Shell and other investors create those jobs, British Columbians can take advantage of them because we've given them the skills to do that.
You know, as I've had a chance to talk to the Premier about, you know, what does this program really look like structurally? How does it build up over the next couple of years? There's an opportunity here, I think, to create a model for the world on how to do this the right way. And I think it's going the right direction right now.
That's great news. One of the things of being a journalist is you can't get away from politics in our province. And this next question, I think, sort of touches on a little bit of that. Whenever you see companies like Shell or BG, Chevron, all of them bringing these projects forward, there is always going to be some sort of opposition. In many cases, this opposition focuses on the bigger global issues about global greenhouse gas emissions. And those are noble causes, noble issues to discuss, and important issues to discuss. But too often I see that companies like Shell get dragged into this conversation because of an individual project that you're bringing forward. And that one individual project isn't going to have a massive impact on the bigger issue of global greenhouse gas emissions. But each project gets dragged into this bigger conversation. And I've had industry people say, well, this isn't fair because we're not capable of handling this. This is a much bigger societal conversation we should be having. So, Premier, I guess this is a question for you. How do we as citizens or as government have this conversation without hindering economic expansion, economic growth when companies are interested in investing in British Columbia?
Well, I think first you have to have it. I mean, gone are the days when W.A.C. Bennett could dam a massive valley without digging up the graveyard, without logging the land underneath it. I mean, without seeking consent. Now, that can't happen in Canada anymore, and it shouldn't. It certainly shouldn't happen in British Columbia. We have to create the space for that conversation to happen, and we do. So in the course of this last couple of years, we've been deeply engaged with First Nations, with communities, with labor unions, with the citizenry of the province, and set out a very clear plan and a goal for where we wanted to go, how we wanted to get there. So, you know, I look at the election as part of that conversation. I look at the ongoing consultations that we're having as part of that conversation. And the conversation has to include space to understand what it is people need from these projects to make it work for them. There will always be people who are opposed to something out there. That's true. But I think for most people, once they understand the reality of what's happening on one side, and once we work to understand what it is that they need to make the project work for them, we can almost always find agreement. And this process has, I think, been a real model of creating space for that conversation to happen, and I think so far finding a really remarkable amount of consensus around it. There's still bumps in the road, areas we need to work through. We're not there yet, but I think because the dialogue's been honest, it's been direct, and there's been enough time allocated for it, and real purposeful effort, we are getting there.
Do you think part of that conversation also focuses on a bit of the rural-urban divide in our province? And maybe I'm exaggerating, and sometimes I refer to it as latte sip in Vancouverites, not understanding.
Well, you're one of them, Jeff.
I know, I'm from Williams Lake, but I've turned into one of them, I'm sure, after 20 years of living in the big city. But sometimes you see this conversation, you see these protests, and they're mostly folks here in the city that in many cases, I always say there's life beyond hope. In many cases, life beyond Boundary Road. They don't even understand how the suburbs work sometimes. But there seems to be that rural-urban divide in our province, and I think these debates kind of focus on that. You touch on that. Would you agree with that?
I think that's true. I think that people in urban communities often feel disconnected from where the wealth is created. 2/3 of the wealth in our province is created outside the Lower Mainland, in rural communities, resource-based communities. And despite the fact that so many people in Vancouver depend for their living on natural gas, on coal, on lumber, on any of the resources that we produce, people forget the contribution that it makes. Part of this conversation has been trying to connect those two things, helping people understand how liquefied natural gas is going to have a real impact on the service sector in Vancouver, accounting, law, engineering, how it's going to kickstart our technology economy here in the Lower Mainland as well, the contribution it's going to make to institutions of higher learning. There are all those contributions that will come from natural gas that is extracted in the Northeast, moved across the North, and liquefied in the Northwest. Mm-hmm. That's going to have a big impact on this very city. It's a conversation I don't think we're going to resolve, I don't think we're going to close that gap forever, but I think this has done more than probably anyone we've had recently to help people understand each other.
Ultimately, we're talking about a citizen engagement, and I think energy firms are forced into this conversation now with social media, and you've had to sort of change your tack a little bit, I'm sure, and I've learned a lot in the last 10 years or so, because you also get attacked with, well, it's the fossil fuel industry, it's big energy, you get all those kind of negative comments thrown at you, but I always say you're also technology firms who are also involved in best practices and learning from that. But give me a sense of what it means engaging with the public for energy firms, because the game is so different now in regards to everybody getting involved.
You know, it's funny because energy used to be all around technology and big project capability and all those sort of kind of hard technical skills. That's about a third of the equation now, and about 2/3 is really more the social aspects that you're talking about, and what we as a company tend to call non-technical risk. So it's all the other things about working with communities and really, being the kind of company, the kind of principled company that can get these things done, and where we can live together with communities and with governments, as I said earlier, for decades and decades to come. It is the core of what we do now. It's actually, if I look at how I spend my time running this part of the business, it's at least half of my time is spent doing exactly that. And that's a change over the last 20 years.
Are more citizens you find engaged in that sense, or are you still dealing with certain stereotypes about energy firms and just calling it big oil and all those types of things?
I think there's tremendous stereotypes about big energy firms, first of all. But and we carry part of that burden ourselves. We haven't been great at kind of getting the point across that we do a lot more than what those stereotypes would indicate. And I'll pick up your point around greenhouse gases to come back to that. So yes, I think there's an enormous role, obviously, for governments in getting some orientation and some cohesiveness about how we address that bigger issue.
Politicians will give you great advice on how to get rid of stereotypes and improve your reputation.
Well, we're going to have to talk afterwards. We have to spend some time afterwards on that topic. But on CO2, I mean, so greenhouse gases, CO2 for us, there's a lot companies can do as well. So you talk about the stereotype of a big energy firm. I wonder how many people know that we advocate for a price on carbon as part of this bigger global picture. That internal to our company, we charge ourselves $40 a ton for every ton of CO2 that gets emitted. So if we bring forward a project, take it to the board, for example, say we want to do this oil sands project or this LNG project or something else around the world, those economics are burdened with $40 a ton for every ton of emissions that come along with that project. Now that does a couple of things. First of all, it makes you live in a world where there is a price on carbon, and you start to make your investment choices, like moving more to natural gas based on that kind of thought process. It also puts engineers and other people that design these projects in the frame of mind of how do I start to reduce those emissions and improve the economics of my project. So we do that. And I think the other thing we do is we deliver to British Columbia then a world-class carbon intensity type project for LNG. I mean, that's part of what we can bring to the table.
But the stakes are much higher. You cannot afford to be making any big mistakes. You saw with the BP oil spills is a different, obviously, we're talking about oil there, but in regards to being reacting to society does not have that patience either. You have to raise your game as energy firms, and you have. Ultimately.
Yeah, unquestionably. I mean, I think, from the social aspects of running a company, of being a good company, the stakes have clearly gone up every year, and my assumption is they will continue to go up from now on. But that's okay, and that's why if you're a firm that runs on principles and you clearly understand and your population understands what those are, then you make the right choices along the way. You take the right perspective on something like safety. You mentioned the offshore business in particular, and you gain the internal confidence you need that you can actually do these things the right way.
I think from a government perspective, we went through a long period where governments did what they wanted, or and just got it done, and in doing so created winners and losers. Then we went through a period where people said, well, we need to consult and we need to include, but you can't do business that way. And now I think we are in a world where we can include people, we can consult, we can accommodate, we can make it work and make the business happen at the same time. And the trick to that is not seeing the world as winners and losers anymore. It's trying to create as many winners as you possibly can and recognizing that when people have a legitimate complaint, it can often be addressed, and you can take people from feeling like they're going to lose something to recognizing that they can be actually a part of gaining something. And that's the new paradigm for government, and I hear Marvin saying that's the paradigm that Shell is working from as well. It's a totally different way of doing business. But it's not any worse. I would argue it's a lot better.
You're talking about citizen engagement. One of the issues, and you've touched on this a little bit, Premier, is the Aboriginal community and involving them in this conversation. I remember we were the trip to Asia, having a conversation with Ellis Ross in the Haisla Nation. He is completely engaged in this and wanting to be a part of this LNG this energy, LNG industry that you're building. But talk a little bit about engaging and involving the Aboriginal community, because sometimes the community itself at times has been viewed as, well, they hold back development. But when I talk to people like Ellis, they're completely engaged, and many other communities well within the Aboriginal family. Talk a little bit about getting them involved and how they will play a role in regards to LNG.
Well, I think again, we need to move past a world where we say there's people that are for it and people that are against it, and recognize that many, many people have legitimate concerns about resource development projects, and that there are ways to accommodate those concerns, and to not just accommodate, but ensure that people benefit from that. If you live on top of a sea of energy, for heaven's sakes, you should benefit when that energy is extracted from your land. That's my view. And that's the way we do business in British Columbia. That's the way Shell has done business all around the world. So I think we need to make sure that First Nations are beneficiaries of these projects in new ways, that their membership is included in employment benefits in the long term from these projects. And I think we do have a big generational opportunity here as British Columbians to include First Nations in the mainstream of the economy in a way that we have not done in the past. And so for me, this is a tremendous economic opportunity, tremendous environmental opportunity, and an incredible social opportunity to include people that haven't been included before. And, again, it's about creating winners on every side of the equation here.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great way to look at it. I think the only thing I'd add to that conversation is, for us as a company then, I think the thing we've really learned the most is that it starts very early. So it's this very early consultation around a project, about being just completely transparent about what the impacts of that project will be, and then working together with the community, with First Nations, to say, what's the best way to mitigate this? How can you be partners in this? And that sort of game plan from the very beginning is the only way to get it done correctly.
If you're talking about a relationship that's going to last 20 or 30 or 50 years, you want to get off on the right foot.
Yeah.
It's like anything else.
Yeah.
And that's not coming to the table saying, we've already done all this study, we've done all the design, here it is.
Yes.
It's saying, here's what we're thinking about. Here's some ideas we have. How do we incorporate your ideas into this? And you do it jointly.
Yeah. And I guess that's years of experience also for Shell. I mean, you operate in so many jurisdictions.
Yeah.
This isn't just a North America specific ideal here. I mean, I'm sure you do this in Asia and Europe.
Absolutely.
It's everywhere now, isn't it?
Yeah. No, it is everywhere. And some of this is, there was a time when our mode would have been much more, we'll figure it all out and then we'll bring you the answers. So this is when I describe it that way. These are sort of hard-won lessons of what's the right way to do business.
And I would say too, Jazz, that's not just true with First Nations, although it is particularly true here. That's true with labor unions. Why are we working with the labor movement so closely? Because those workers, those unions have a tremendous opportunity here. Rather than being recipients of the outcome of the plan, let's make them part of the plan. That's true of communities in Kitimat and Port Edward and in Fort Nelson, making all of those communities a part of what we're doing as well. It doesn't change the outcome. It just means that we start the whole project differently.
I promised this conversation will be on time and on budget, just like any future LNG project.
I like the sound.
So, Mr. Odom, I'm going to give you the final word here, or at least your closing words in the Premier after that.
Well, again, just in closing, first of all, I'd say what a great opportunity to be here. I think you look at the crowd that's here in the room today, you feel the energy on the topic of LNG in British Columbia, mix in the vision of the Premier here. It's a pretty exciting time. Huh?
Yeah. Premier?
Well, I'm thrilled to be a part of this today. Thank you, and to everyone for joining us at this our second LNG conference. I said yesterday, welcome to Vancouver. This is a taste of the future. I think we are looking at the future, and it is such an incredible opportunity for the people of British Columbia, and I think for all the private sector investors and for people around the world who will benefit from cleaner air as a result of the work that we are doing here in BC. And we're going to, as you said, Marvin, we're going to set the example, I hope, for the world in some of this stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jazz.
And thank you. Greg, I'm going to pass it along to you.